She walked into Goldman Sachs with stunning curly hair and model-like features that made every head turn. The senior partners saw a pretty face who'd probably gotten the internship through connections. But when their $210 million deal was about to collapse, they discovered that the beautiful girl they dismissed as just another pretty intern had a mind sharper than their entire legal team combined. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This story will change how you see first impressions forever. Sophia Martinez stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor of Goldman Sachs with her portfolio clutched tightly in her hands and her heart pounding against her ribs. Her dark curly hair fell in perfect spirals around her shoulders, catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Manhattan's most prestigious investment bank. At 22, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that stopped conversations and turned heads, with expressive brown eyes and features that could have graced magazine covers. But Sophia wasn't here to model. She was here to prove herself in one of Wall Street's most competitive environments, armed with nothing but a finance degree from Arizona State University and a determination that burned brighter than her stunning appearance suggested. The Goldman Sachs summer internship program was legendary for its exclusivity. Out of 30,000 applications worldwide, only 60 students were selected each year. Most came from Ivy League schools with family connections that stretched back generations through the corridors of financial power. Sophia's acceptance letter had been the result of perfect grades, exceptional test scores, and a personal essay that had apparently impressed someone enough to take a chance on a girl from Phoenix, whose father worked construction and whose mother cleaned houses. As Sophia made her way to the reception desk, every conversation seemed to pause. Senior associates looked up from their Bloomberg terminals, managing directors glanced through their glass office walls. Even the normally unflappable receptionists seemed momentarily distracted by the arrival of someone who looked like she belonged on a movie set rather than a trading floor. Michael Harrison, a third-year associate with slicked-back hair and a Harvard MBA, was the first to approach. His smile was practiced and predatory, the kind worn by men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted through charm and persistence. His eyes lingered a moment too long on her face as he introduced himself and offered to show her around. When Sophia mentioned her assignment to the Mergers and Acquisitions division, Michael's eyebrows rose with surprise and amusement. He suggested that most decorative interns usually ended up in HR or marketing, questioning whether she was sure about tackling the intense world of M&A, with its late nights and complex financial modeling. The comment stung, but Sophia had expected worse. She'd spent her entire academic career being underestimated because of her appearance, watching professors and classmates assume that beauty and intelligence were mutually exclusive. She'd learned to let her work speak louder than her words. She assured him she was looking forward to the challenge, which only widened his smile as he offered to help her transfer to something more suitable if M&A proved too overwhelming. The M&A floor was a universe of controlled chaos. Analysts hunched over multiple monitors displaying financial data that changed by the second. Senior associates barked orders into headsets while simultaneously typing reports and reviewing legal documents. The air hummed with the kind of electric energy that only came from moving billions of dollars with the stroke of a keyboard. Director James Parker noticed Sophia's arrival immediately, primarily because every conversation on the floor had momentarily ceased as heads turned to take in the stunning new intern. At 55, Parker was a Goldman Sachs veteran who'd built his reputation on his ability to spot potential and develop talent. But as he watched Sophia navigate through the maze of desks, he found himself making the same assumptions that had plagued her throughout her academic career. Parker approached with the kind of paternal smile typically reserved for children and house pets. He suggested starting her off slowly with basic research tasks and filing, explaining that the work could be quite complex with lots of financial modeling and legal analysis. Sophia expressed her preference for more substantive work, mentioning her experience with financial modeling and merger analysis, and her desire to contribute meaningfully to current projects. Parker's smile became slightly strained as he insisted it was better to start simple and work your way up, noting that Rome wasn't built in a day. As Sophia was led to a desk in the corner of the floor, she became acutely aware of the whispered conversations and sideways glances following her movement. The other interns, all male and all from prestigious universities, watched with expressions ranging from amusement to resentment. Their designer suits and confident postures spoke of lives lived in preparation for exactly this moment. Brad Morrison, a Harvard Business School student whose family had owned a seat on the New York Stock Exchange for 3 generations, whispered about the diversity initiative being taken seriously if they were recruiting from modeling agencies now. His comment drew quiet laughter from the group of interns gathered around the coffee machine. Preston Wells, whose Princeton MBA and family connections had virtually guaranteed his acceptance, wondered aloud about her actual qualifications, questioning whether she could even read a balance sheet despite being obviously gorgeous. The comments weren't intended to be vicious, but they carried the casual cruelty of privilege, the unconscious assumption that beauty and competence were incompatible traits. These young men had been raised in a world where intelligence was measured by school rankings and family pedigrees, where the idea that someone from a state university could possess superior analytical skills was literally inconceivable. Sophia heard every word, but she'd learned long ago that responding to such comments only reinforced the stereotypes. Instead, she focused on the work she'd been assigned, organizing files, updating databases, and conducting basic research that could have been completed by a competent high school student. But while her official assignments were mundane, Sophia used her peripheral position to observe everything happening around her. She listened to phone conversations about merger terms and due diligence timelines. She absorbed presentations about market conditions and regulatory challenges. She studied financial models and legal documents with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only weapon she possessed in an environment designed to exclude her. The breakthrough opportunity came 3 weeks into her internship, when Goldman Sachs was selected to represent Meridian Industries in their proposed acquisition of Coastal Technologies. The deal was valued at $210 million and represented the largest transaction the M&A division had handled all year. The client was demanding, the timeline was compressed, and the stakes were enormous. Director Parker assembled his team in the main conference room, announcing this was the big leagues with Meridian Industries as one of their most important clients, trusting them to execute a deal that would define their next decade of growth. He gestured toward a wall-mounted monitor displaying the deal structure, explaining they were looking at a complex acquisition with significant regulatory hurdles, international tax implications, and integration challenges requiring months of detailed planning. Michael Harrison was assigned to lead the financial modeling team, Brad Morrison would handle regulatory compliance, and Preston Wells would coordinate due diligence. As assignments were distributed among the chosen few, Sophia remained at her corner desk, officially excluded from the most important project of the summer, but positioned perfectly to observe every aspect of the deal's development. Over the following weeks, the Meridian acquisition consumed the M&A division. Analysts worked 18-hour days building financial models that projected cash flows and synergies across dozens of different scenarios. Legal teams reviewed regulatory requirements in 6 different jurisdictions. Due diligence teams conducted forensic examinations of Coastal Technologies' operations, finances, and market position. Sophia watched it all from her position on the periphery, officially relegated to filing and administrative tasks but absorbing every detail of the complex transaction. She studied the merger agreement during her lunch breaks, reviewed financial projections that other interns left scattered on printers, and quietly familiarized herself with every aspect of a deal that could transform both companies involved. What she discovered during her unauthorized research was deeply troubling. The merger agreement contained a clause buried deep in the regulatory compliance section that seemed innocuous on first reading, but would prove catastrophic if triggered. Section 47B stipulated that if certain environmental regulations were modified by federal agencies within 18 months of the deal's completion, Meridian would be required to assume unlimited liability for any cleanup costs associated with Coastal Technologies' historical operations. The clause had been included as a standard protection for the seller, but what the Goldman Sachs team had failed to recognize was that the Environmental Protection Agency was already in the final stages of implementing new regulations that would retroactively expand liability for industrial sites. The new rules, scheduled to take effect within 6 months, would classify Coastal Technologies' 3 largest manufacturing facilities as contaminated sites requiring immediate remediation. Based on her own research using publicly available EPA documents, Sophia calculated that the cleanup costs would exceed $340 million, far more than the $210 million acquisition price. Meridian Industries would essentially be paying for the privilege of inheriting a financial catastrophe. But Sophia was just an intern from a state school who'd been assigned to filing duties. Her discovery had been made during unofficial research using information that wasn't part of the formal due diligence process. Bringing such concerns to the attention of senior partners would require her to admit that she'd been conducting unauthorized analysis of confidential documents. For several days, Sophia wrestled with her options. She could remain silent and protect her position, allowing the deal to proceed and hoping that someone else would eventually discover the problem. She could attempt to share her concerns through unofficial channels, perhaps mentioning her findings to one of the other interns who might bring the issue to management's attention. Or she could risk her internship by directly challenging the work of analysts and associates whose credentials far exceeded her own. The decision was made for her on a Thursday morning when she overheard a phone conversation between Director Parker and the client. Meridian's CEO was pushing for an accelerated timeline, demanding that all documents be finalized by the following Monday so the deal could be announced before the company's quarterly earnings call. The urgency in Parker's voice was unmistakable as he assured the client that Goldman Sachs would meet the deadline. The merger agreement would be signed within 4 days, legally binding both companies to a transaction that would devastate Meridian's finances and potentially destroy the careers of everyone involved in its execution. That afternoon, Sophia made a decision that would define not just her internship but her entire career. She printed out her analysis of the environmental liability issue, gathered the supporting EPA documents she'd discovered, and requested a meeting with Director Parker. His assistant looked at Sophia with barely concealed skepticism, questioning what kind of issue an intern could possibly discover that their entire team of analysts hadn't already identified. When Sophia explained it was related to environmental liability and regulatory compliance with documentation suggesting the deal structure contained significant risk, the assistant's expression shifted from skepticism to annoyance. The assistant pointed out that Director Parker didn't have time to review speculative concerns from interns and suggested discussing it with associates or including it in her end-of-internship report. Sophia insisted this couldn't wait until the end of the internship since the deal was scheduled to close on Monday, and if she was right about the liability issue, Meridian could be facing hundreds of millions in unexpected costs. The implicit threat was clear: challenging the work of her superiors was a career-ending move for an intern who'd already been marginalized within the organization. But Sophia had spent her entire life being underestimated, and she'd learned that sometimes the only way to be heard was to risk everything on being right. After expressing her understanding of the risk but needing just 5 minutes of Parker's time, something in her tone must have registered, because the assistant's expression softened slightly and she arranged the meeting. Sophia nodded and waited while the assistant made the call. Through the glass, she watched Parker's reaction to the request, saw his visible irritation at being interrupted, observed the brief consultation with his associates, who clearly questioned the wisdom of meeting with an intern during such a critical period. Finally, Parker gestured for her to enter his office. The space was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of lower Manhattan and walls lined with awards, diplomas, and photographs of Parker with various financial luminaries. He didn't look up from his documents as Sophia entered, forcing her to stand awkwardly in front of his desk while he finished reviewing a merger clause. "Miss Martinez," he said finally, his tone suggesting that her 5 minutes had already begun counting down. Sarah tells me you have concerns about the Meridian deal. I have to say, I'm surprised. You haven't been involved in any substantive aspects of the transaction. No, sir, I haven't, Sophia acknowledged. But I've been conducting independent research on regulatory compliance issues, and I've discovered something that I believe requires immediate attention. Parker's eyebrows rose slightly. Independent research. On what authority? The question was a challenge to her right to involve herself in matters beyond her assigned responsibilities. Sophia took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether her concerns were heard or whether she'd be dismissed as an overreaching intern. I was reviewing publicly available EPA documentation as part of my own education about regulatory compliance in M&A transactions, she said carefully. I discovered that the Environmental Protection Agency is implementing new regulations that could significantly impact the liability provisions in Section 47B of the merger agreement. For the first time since she'd entered his office, Parker gave her his full attention. Section 47B was one of the most complex aspects of the deal structure, involving intricate legal language about environmental liability that had required extensive negotiation between both companies' legal teams. What specifically are you referring to? He asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. Sophia opened her folder and placed her analysis on his desk. The new EPA regulations expand retroactive liability for industrial contamination. Based on the historical operations of Coastal Technologies' 3 largest facilities, I calculate that Meridian could be facing cleanup costs exceeding $340 million if these regulations are implemented as currently drafted. Parker stared at the documents she'd placed before him, then looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. These calculations were done by you personally? Yes, sir. Using EPA site assessments, historical production data, and the new liability framework outlined in the proposed regulations. And you're saying our entire legal and analytical team missed this issue? The question was loaded with implications. Sophia was essentially claiming that a state school intern had identified a massive problem that had escaped the notice of Harvard-trained lawyers and analysts who'd spent months reviewing every aspect of the transaction. I'm saying that the issue exists and requires evaluation by people with much more expertise than I have. She replied diplomatically. I could be wrong about the interpretation or the timeline, but the potential liability seems significant enough to warrant immediate review. Parker studied her analysis for several long minutes, his expression growing increasingly serious as he absorbed the implications of what she was suggesting. If she was correct, the Meridian deal would transform from a strategic triumph into a financial catastrophe that could damage Goldman Sachs's reputation and potentially result in legal liability for inadequate due diligence. Wait here, he said finally, reaching for his phone. I need to get our regulatory compliance team in here immediately. Over the next hour, Parker's office filled with senior associates, legal specialists, and regulatory experts who reviewed Sophia's analysis with the kind of urgent intensity typically reserved for crisis management. Phone calls were made to EPA contacts, legal databases were searched for precedent cases, and financial models were hastily recalculated to incorporate the potential liability. With each passing minute, the gravity of Sophia's discovery became more apparent. The proposed EPA regulations were indeed scheduled for implementation within 6 months. Coastal Technologies facilities were clearly within the scope of the new liability framework. The cleanup costs would almost certainly exceed $300 million and could potentially reach $400 million if contamination was more extensive than current assessments suggested. The Meridian acquisition, scheduled to close in 3 days, would have been the most disastrous transaction in Goldman Sachs's recent history. How the hell did we miss this? Parker asked his team, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. We've had 12 people working on regulatory compliance for 3 months. How does an intern find something that our entire team overlooked? The question hung in the air like an accusation.
The senior associates, who'd been assigned to regulatory review, looked uncomfortable, while the legal specialists began reviewing their own due diligence processes for gaps that could have allowed such a significant issue to escape notice. Michael Harrison, who'd been leading the financial modeling team, spoke up with visible frustration. The EPA regulations weren't included in our standard compliance review because they're still in the proposal stage. Standard practice is to focus on existing regulations, not potential future changes. Potential future changes that are scheduled for implementation in 6 months, Parker replied coldly. On a deal that includes specific liability provisions for exactly this type of regulatory modification. The room fell silent as the implications of the oversight became clear. Goldman Sachs had been prepared to advise their client to complete a transaction that would have resulted in financial ruin, and they'd been saved only by the unauthorized research of an intern who wasn't supposed to be involved in the deal at all. "What do we do now?" asked Sarah Chen, the senior associate responsible for legal coordination. "The client is expecting final documents tomorrow morning. They've already scheduled the announcement for Monday." Parker looked at the analysis Sophia had prepared, then at the young woman who'd potentially saved his career and the firm's reputation. "We call the client immediately and explain that we've discovered a material issue that requires additional review. We recommend postponing the transaction until we can negotiate new liability protections or identify alternative structures that address the environmental concerns." "They're going to be furious," Harrison pointed out. "Meridian CEO has been pushing for this timeline for weeks. They'll want to know how we missed something this significant." "We'll tell them the truth," Parker replied grimly. "We made an error in our regulatory review process and were fortunate that it was caught before the deal closed. Better to face their anger now than their lawsuits later." As the meeting broke up and team members scattered to begin the difficult process of unwinding 3 months of preparation, Parker asked Sophia to remain behind. "That was exceptional work," he said once they were alone. "I'm curious how you even thought to examine EPA regulations that weren't part of our standard review process." Sophia hesitated, unsure how much of her methodology to review. "I've been studying merger arbitrage strategies for the past 2 years. One of the patterns I noticed was that environmental liability often created unexpected costs in industrial acquisitions. When I saw that Coastal Technologies operated manufacturing facilities, I thought it was worth investigating potential regulatory changes that could affect cleanup responsibilities." "And you did this research on your own time, using publicly available information?" "Yes, sir. I know I wasn't authorized to conduct independent analysis, but I was trying to learn as much as possible about the transaction." Parker studied her with new appreciation. "Miss Martinez, in 15 years at this firm, I've never seen an intern demonstrate the kind of analytical thinking you've shown here. You potentially saved our client hundreds of millions of dollars and protected Goldman Sachs from a catastrophic advisory failure." The praise felt surreal after weeks of being marginalized and dismissed. Sophia had spent her entire internship being treated like a decorative accessory, and now she was being credited with preventing a financial disaster. "Thank you, sir. I was just trying to contribute however I could." "You've contributed more than our entire regulatory team," Parker said dryly. "I think it's time we gave you work that matches your capabilities." Word of Sophia's discovery spread through the M&A division like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone knew that the beautiful intern they dismissed as eye candy had identified a $340 million liability that their most senior analysts had missed. The story took on legendary qualities as it was retold, with each version emphasizing different aspects of the dramatic reversal. For the male interns who'd spent weeks questioning her qualifications, the revelation was particularly humbling. Brad Morrison, who'd made jokes about recruiting from modeling agencies, found himself studying Sophia's analysis with reluctant admiration. Her methodology was sophisticated, her calculations were precise, and her writing was clearer than most MBA-level reports he'd seen. "I can't believe we underestimated her this badly," he admitted to Preston Wells during a late-night conversation in the intern common area. "She's not just smart, she's brilliant, and we treated her like she was only here because she's gorgeous." Preston, whose Princeton MBA had made him confident of his intellectual superiority, was struggling with his own assumptions. The worst part is that we had access to the same information she used. We could have found this issue ourselves if we'd bothered to look beyond our standard procedures. The conversation was overheard by several other interns, and within hours a consensus had emerged that Sophia Martinez was not only the most beautiful intern in Goldman Sachs history but also potentially the most talented. The cognitive dissonance was jarring for young men who'd been raised to believe that such combinations didn't exist in nature. Michael Harrison's reaction was more complex. As someone who'd appointed himself as Sophia's unofficial mentor and protector, he was forced to confront the patronizing nature of his previous behavior. His offer to help her transfer to a more suitable department now seemed laughably condescending. "I made an ass of myself," he confided to his roommate over drinks that evening. "I talked to her like she was some lost kid who needed guidance, when she was actually the smartest person in the building." The client reaction was equally dramatic. Meridian C, who'd been furious about the proposed delay, became grateful advocate once the full scope of the avoided liability was explained. His company's stock price actually rose when news of the postponement leaked, as investors recognized that management had dodged a potentially catastrophic mistake. "I don't care if this deal takes 6 more months to restructure," the CEO told Parker during an emergency conference call. "You just saved my company from bankruptcy. Whatever intern found this issue deserves a permanent position on our account." The restructuring process took 3 weeks, during which Sophia found herself at the center of every major decision. Her insights into regulatory compliance were sought by senior partners, her analysis methods were studied by the entire team, and her opinions on alternative deal structures carried weight that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. The transformation in how she was treated was remarkable. Directors who'd previously ignored her now made point of consulting her on complex issues. Associates who'd questioned her presence now competed to work with her on projects. Even the administrative staff who'd viewed her with suspicion now treated her with the respect typically reserved for senior personnel. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Sophia viewed herself. For her entire academic career, she'd struggled with the assumption that her beauty somehow diminished her intellectual achievements. At Goldman Sachs, she'd initially tried to minimize her appearance and prove her worth through quiet competence. The discovery of the environmental liability issue had finally allowed her to demonstrate that she possessed both qualities in abundance. "I spent so much energy trying to prove I wasn't just a pretty face," she reflected during a conversation with Director Parker. "I never considered that maybe I could be both beautiful and brilliant, and that neither quality diminished the other." Parker nodded thoughtfully. The financial industry has a long history of underestimating people based on superficial characteristics. "We've missed out on tremendous talent because we couldn't see past our own biases." The Meridian deal eventually closed 4 months later, after extensive restructuring that addressed the environmental liability concerns. The final transaction value was reduced to $180 million, but both companies avoided the catastrophic exposure that would have resulted from the original agreement. Goldman Sachs received industry recognition for their thorough due diligence process and their ability to identify material risks that other firms had missed. Director Parker was promoted to managing director, and the M&A division used the Meridian case as a template for enhanced regulatory review procedures. For Sophia, the internship became a launching pad for a career that exceeded her wildest expectations. She received full-time offers from every major investment bank on Wall Street, but chose to remain at Goldman Sachs, where she'd proven that assumptions about beauty and intelligence were not just wrong but potentially expensive. Years later, as a vice president in Goldman Sachs' M&A division, Sophia would often speak to intern classes about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and the value of diverse perspectives in complex problem solving. Her story became part of the firm's culture, a reminder that brilliance could come in unexpected packages and that underestimating people based on their appearance was not just morally wrong but financially dangerous. "Never assume you know someone's capabilities based on how they look," she would tell new interns. "The person you dismiss today might be the one who saves your career tomorrow." The lesson resonated throughout Goldman Sachs and eventually spread to other firms across Wall Street. Sophia Martinez had not only saved a $210 million deal but had also challenged an entire industry to reconsider its assumptions about beauty, intelligence, and the dangerous cost of superficial judgments. Her curly hair still turned heads when she walked through the trading floor, but now the attention came with respect for the brilliant mind that had proven that true worth couldn't be measured by appearance alone.
If you've made it this far, you've witnessed something powerful. The story of Sophia Martinez, who refused to let others' shallow assumptions define her worth. She walked into Goldman Sachs, knowing she'd be judged by her appearance, knowing she'd have to work twice as hard to prove herself, knowing that many would see her beauty as evidence that she didn't belong. But Sophia did more than belong. She excelled. She saved a company from financial ruin. She changed an entire industry's perspective on talent and potential. How many Sophias have you encountered in your life and dismissed because they didn't fit your expectations? How many brilliant minds have you overlooked because you couldn't see past surface appearances? How many times have you been guilty of the same shallow thinking that nearly cost Goldman Sachs $210 million? This story isn't just about one woman's triumph over prejudice. It's about the deadly cost of our assumptions. It's about the talent we waste when we judge books by their covers. It's about the potential we destroy when we let stereotypes cloud our judgment. Every day, people like Sophia walk into rooms where they're underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. Every day, their brilliant ideas go unheard because others can't see past their appearance, their background, or their age. Every day we lose opportunities for greatness because we're blinded by our own biases. If this story changed how you see people, if it made you question your own assumptions, if it reminded you that intelligence and beauty aren't mutually exclusive, then you owe it to yourself and others to subscribe. Because these stories matter. Because these lessons save careers, companies, and lives. Don't just hit subscribe for more content. Hit subscribe as a commitment to seeing people differently. Hit subscribe as a promise to look deeper than surface appearances. Hit subscribe because the next person you underestimate might be the one who could change everything. Subscribe because Sophia Martinez and millions like her deserve to have their stories told. Subscribe because every view, every like, every share helps fight the culture of superficial judgment that nearly destroyed a brilliant career before it began. Subscribe because in a world obsessed with appearances, we need more people willing to recognize that true brilliance comes in every form imaginable. The subscribe button is right there. Your conscience knows what to do. Be part of the change. Be part of the solution. Be part of ensuring that the next Sophia Martinez doesn't have to prove her worth twice just because she's beautiful. Subscribe now. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they transform how we see the world and everyone in it.